"You are the shame of this family," my mother said into the microphone at the exact second the Marine colonel by the bar stopped laughing and turned his head toward me. The ballroom in La Jolla fell quiet in an instant. More than 100 guests sat at round tables under white chandeliers, forks, suspended champagne glasses, hovering all of them watching my mother in her glittering dress, and me standing alone near the dessert table with a plastic cup of red punch in my hand. I was 28 in a plain navy dress that did not shine, parked beside a cake that suddenly felt like a spotlight. My mother's voice brightened the way it always did when she polished cruelty and called it humor. "Our late bloomer," she told the room. 28, no husband, no real career, still playing with laptops like a teenager. But we love her anyway. A few people laughed, that strained sound people make when they know something is ugly, but do not want to challenge it. Brianna did not bother pretending. My sister leaned toward the microphone from the head table, curls perfect, dress expensive. "She even brought her computer tonight," Brianna called out, "just in case anyone needs their printer fixed. That is her specialty." The room chuckled louder. I felt my jaw tighten. I took a sip of punch that suddenly tasted like metal. At the table closest to me, my mother's older brother lifted his glass and added, "She lives off the government anyway. Our little welfare tech girl." That one landed. People laughed for real. I stood still and let the words hit. I had years of practice. Stand, breathe, do not flinch. To them, I was exactly what my mother had painted. The quiet one, the strange one, the daughter who never matched the polished family picture, no ring on my finger, no job title they could brag about, no feed full of smiling proof that I was living correctly. In their minds, I sat in some windowless office, poking at broken routers for a paycheck that barely covered rent. My father sat near the head table, folding and unfolding his napkin. He did not look at me. "We are just grateful she could make it," my mother went on. "She is always too busy with her little computer job. You know how it is when someone has no real life to go home to." I watched eyes slide over me and catch on the labels she had just pinned to my chest. Shame, failure, extra. By the bar, the Marine colonel had gone still. A moment earlier, he had been laughing with two other men in dress uniforms, glass in hand. Now he stared across the room at me, the color draining from his face. His fingers loosened. The glass dropped and hit the floor with a crack that snapped through the silence. Conversation stopped mid-word. People turned. He did not look down. He just kept staring. My mother turned slightly annoyed that anything had cut into her speech. "Well," she said with a tight laugh, "looks like someone already made friends with the bar." A few guests chuckled on cue. The colonel did not. Slowly, as if some deep habit had taken over, he straightened his back until his spine locked into place. His heels drew together. His shoulders squared. The two officers beside him went quiet, their faces shifting from party light to something closer to alarm. They knew that posture. So did I. I had seen it on secure screens, men and women in uniforms snapping to attention when certain names appeared at the top of a briefing slide. His eyes never left mine. For a heartbeat, the whole room hung between two stories, the one my family liked to tell and the one I actually lived. I felt that familiar cold focus slide into place, the one that usually arrived with red alerts and incident boards. I could have given him a way out, a small shake of my head, some signal to stand down and play along with my mother's version of me. I did nothing. I let the silence stretch until it hummed. My mother lifted the microphone again, her smile now edged with confusion. "Is there a problem, Colonel Rourke?" she asked, trying to pull the room back under her control. He swallowed his gaze, locked on me like a man who has just realized he's been standing under the wrong chain of command. In that moment, something inside me settled. Not rage, not triumph, just a steady certainty. In a few more seconds, I thought every single person in this room is going to understand exactly why a decorated Marine colonel is afraid of the family failure by the dessert table. I grew up in Temecula during the years when summers smelled like dust and ripe oranges, and the biggest truth I carried was that I did not belong to the family whose last name I shared a truth that settled into my bones before I even understood what belonging meant, and it followed me from childhood into every room where my mother and sister shined without effort. From the moment I was old enough to understand tone, I learned that I was the quiet kid, the strange one, the child who never fit the cheerful family picture my mother tried to curate for neighbors and relatives, and every reminder of that mismatch was delivered softly at first and then more sharply as the years went by, always wrapped in the kind of politeness that stings worse than open anger, the kind that makes a child think silence is the safest choice. My mother adored Brianna, her all-American daughter, as she often introduced her at gatherings, a girl who wore bright dresses and smiled perfectly in every photograph, a girl who seemed built from everything my mother valued, while I stayed in the background with my hair unbrushed and a book in my hand, watching the way my mother's face softened whenever Brianna entered the room, a softness I never saw directed toward me. My father stood somewhere in the middle, not cruel, but absent in the ways that mattered, present at the dinner table, but never stepping in when comments floated across to me about being odd or too quiet or not quite right, and the absence of protection did its own slow damage over time. I remember one summer when I was 10 a week before school ended, when the heat pressed against the house, and I walked down the hallway for a glass of water, the carpet rough under my bare feet, and I froze, because I heard my mother on the phone with my aunt in a tired voice. I rarely heard saying that if my aunt did not agree to take me for a few weeks, she would send me to the cheap summer camp on the other side of town, because she was too exhausted to look at my face every day, and I stood there holding my breath until my chest hurt and wondered for the first time if children could be traded the way people traded furniture or old clothes, something passed around out of inconvenience. That moment branded something invisible inside me, a quiet understanding that I was not a daughter, but a burden that needed managing. And from then on, I tried to shrink myself into corners whenever possible, so no one would feel bothered by my existence. Even as a child, I had a pull toward mechanical things. I loved taking apart radios and small kitchen timers to understand their wiring. I loved the order inside them, the way circuits responded with logic rather than emotion. And later, I found the same comfort in early coding books at the school library, spending hours tracing patterns and solving problems, until the chaos of home dissolved for a while. Yet, every time my mother found me hunched over wires or a screen, she looked at me the way some people look at a stain they cannot remove, telling friends that I had strange habits and that something about me was off, almost as if curiosity were a sickness, and quiet intelligence, something to be corrected. From 2006 to 2012, the pattern only deepened each year, adding new proof that Brianna was the bright star, and I was the shadow they preferred not to acknowledge, and the memories of that time blur into one long hallway of small humiliations, each one subtle enough that no one outside our house would have noticed, but sharp enough that I felt their edge every day. There was the parent-teacher night, where my mother breezed past my science fair project without even glancing at it, choosing instead to ask Brianna if she needed help setting up her cheer posters. And there were the birthdays, where I unwrapped discount puzzle books while Brianna received new dresses and makeup kits and the latest phone. And there were the car rides where my mother turned the radio up whenever I tried to speak, so she would not have to hear me explain the things I was excited about. At 12 years old, I found an envelope tucked into an old cookbook that belonged to my grandmother, the grandmother who had passed away the year before. And inside the envelope was a handwritten note with my name on it, along with a small check intended as a future scholarship for me, because she had noticed how I loved learning. Yet when I asked my mother about it, she snatched the paper from my hand and said that the money was too little to matter, and that I should focus on finding ways to pay for school myself instead of expecting others to support me. And I realized much later that she had kept that money for herself without hesitation. I remember the way my stomach tightened when she closed the kitchen drawer where she had placed the check, the soft click of the wood sounding like the shutting of a door that had never really been open for me anyway. And in that moment, I understood that affection in our house was a currency I could not earn because the rules had never been written for someone like me. As the years passed, I watched Brianna glide through adolescence with ease, earning praise for her beauty and her bright energy, while I drifted deeper into textbooks and small electronic projects, finding refuge in anything that made sense, building the foundation for skills that would eventually carry me into a world far greater than the one my family could imagine. But at the time, all I felt was the steady weight of knowing that nothing I did would ever be enough to shift the way my mother saw me. Sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to have someone see potential in me instead of problems, to have someone look at the things I created and say that they mattered. But those thoughts were soft and dangerous, so I packed them away and focused on surviving each day with as little friction as possible. I learned to move quietly through the house, learned to anticipate moods, learned to keep my talents to myself, so no one could use them as new reasons to point out how different I was. And by the time I reached the end of those 6 years, I had become an expert at disappearing even when standing in the middle of a room. What none of them knew, not then, and not for a long time after, was that every small cruelty was turning me into someone they would someday fail to recognize, someone who would rise far beyond the limits they placed on me, someone who would one day stand in a crowded ballroom and watch the shock spread across their faces as the truth finally found its way to the surface. I learned early that every small victory in my life carried a shadow, and by the time I reached high school, that shadow grew sharper, more deliberate, something that hovered behind every achievement, waiting for the moment my family could twist it into something embarrassing. And the first real humiliation that marked the turning point of everything came during my junior year when I won the national STEM competition, a competition that required months of coding, mechanical design, and late nights repairing circuits until my fingers were stiff. Yet when the results came out and my name was listed at the top with a full invitation to compete internationally and a direct consideration for MIT's early admission program, no one in my family so much as looked up from their dinner plates, and the silence at that table filled the room in a way that felt heavier than any insult. My mother finally broke the quiet with a sigh, saying that I was bragging again and that real accomplishments did not need announcing, while Brianna, who had not attended a single event or shown any interest in what I was building, rolled her eyes and typed something quickly on her phone. And later that night, I saw her Facebook post a short caption under a smiling selfie, saying that her little sister had only won because our school was weak and that it was not a big deal. A post that gathered likes and laughing emojis from her friends, a post that made my chest burn in a way I could not admit to anyone. I kept telling myself that the work mattered more than the applause, that recognition from teachers and judges meant enough, but even as I tried to believe that, I felt the sting of knowing that the people who shared my blood refused to share even the smallest pride in me. When MIT sent me an official letter inviting me to interview for their early engineering cohort, the envelope arrived in the afternoon mail thick and stamped with the seal I had dreamed of for years. But when I asked about the mail, my mother told me nothing had arrived, and it was only when I went to take out the trash that I saw the corner of the envelope tucked between old newspapers in the recycling bin, the paper slightly bent, as if it had been tossed there without a second thought. I reached for it with shaking hands, and when I opened it, my heart raced, not from excitement, but from anger that someone had decided I was unworthy of information that belonged to me. I confronted my mother gently at first, asking why the letter was thrown away, and she looked at me with a mixture of boredom and irritation, saying that someone like me would never fit in at a place like MIT, and she did not want me to get my hopes up because it would only embarrass the family when I inevitably failed. Then she added that MIT was for leaders and that I should focus on realistic goals instead of chasing institutions that would chew me up. Her words sliced deeper than she probably realized, yet something inside me tightened, a quiet resistance forming even if I did not express it aloud, And that night, I went online using the public library computer to contact MIT myself, explaining that the letter had been misplaced and asking if the interview slot was still available. And to my shock and relief, they responded warmly, telling me that they had been waiting to hear from me and that my application had stood out. I completed the virtual interview from the library as well because my home was too loud and too unpredictable for something so important. And a week later, I received an email saying that I had been accepted into the early program with high recommendation for a scholarship, a moment that should have been celebratory, but instead felt like a secret victory carved out from a battlefield no one else could see. The true humiliation came later at a family gathering held for my cousin's engagement party, where 40 people filled the backyard, and during the introductions, my mother stood near the patio stairs holding a glass of wine, while relatives asked about our lives, and when someone asked her how proud she must be of my recent achievements, she laughed lightly and said that I had applied to MIT but been rejected, and that I was better suited for local community colleges, where I would not feel overwhelmed. A lie delivered so casually that it took me a moment to register it, and when I tried to speak, she placed a hand on my arm and told me not to interrupt adults, her voice sharp enough to silence me on the spot. The relatives nodded sympathetically as if I were a child who had failed a simple test, and one aunt even patted my shoulder and told me that not everyone was meant for prestigious paths, and that I should find comfort in simple things because academia could be cruel, and I stood there swallowing the humiliation in pieces because I knew that arguing would only make it worse, and the humiliation etched itself into my memory in a way that would never fade. Later that night, Brianna loudly told the younger cousins that I had exaggerated everything and that I liked to act mysterious to look smarter, and a few laughed, looking at me the way people look at someone who pretends to be something they are not. And though I kept my expression calm, I felt something inside me shift, not anger exactly, but a cold clarity, the beginning of a long, silent rebellion. That was the night I realized my victories would never matter to them. The night I understood that to survive, I would need to build a life they could not touch, a life fortified by achievements they would never see coming. And although I could not name it then, that was the moment the foundation of the person I would become began to form, the person who would one day command rooms they were not allowed to enter, the person they would stand before in shock as the truth unraveled in front of them. When I arrived at Stanford with the ROTC Cybertrack scholarship that I had fought for without a single ounce of encouragement from home, I thought distance might soften something in my chest, maybe even allow the ache from years of dismissal to fade. But the silence from my family during orientation week reminded me that physical miles meant nothing when emotional distance had been carved long ago. And as I watched other students hug their parents, pose for pictures, and walk across campus surrounded by people who believed in them, I tried to steady the knot in my stomach while pretending that independence was all I needed. I buried myself in coursework in early morning PT and cryptography labs that stretched past midnight, and every small breakthrough felt like proof that I belonged, that the door my family tried to close on my future had cracked open enough for me to slip through, and when professors praised my analytical speed, or when an ROTC instructor told me I had leadership instincts rare for someone my age, I felt a spark of pride I tried to hold quietly inside. By the time sophomore year ended, and I returned home for the summer of 2018, I had begun preparing an internship application for a coveted position in a federal cyber program, an internship that required polished essays, security questionnaires, and advanced coding exercises, all stored neatly on my laptop, the same laptop I had bought with 3 part-time jobs because my family refused to help. The first night home, I placed my backpack in my old room, the one that still felt foreign despite the posters that had never been removed. And when I woke up the next morning, my laptop was gone, the desk empty except for the faint outline where it had rested before, and for a moment I thought I had misplaced it in exhaustion. But as I searched the closet, the drawers, and even the car, a cold certainty tightened in my chest. I walked to Brianna's room, pushed the door open, and there it was, on her bed, open logged in. Screen glowing with my documents arranged in chaotic order files, renamed, some missing entirely, and Brianna sat cross-legged beside it, scrolling through my private folders with a smirk that told me she'd been waiting for the confrontation. She did not look guilty when I asked why she had taken it. Instead, she shrugged and said she had only wanted to see what made me think I was so special. Then added that my writing was not impressive and that my essay looked average, and my throat tightened when I realized she had deleted the entire draft of my internship application, not out of ignorance, but with intent because the recycle bin was empty and the cloud autosave had been logged out. I felt a sharp ringing in my ears as I stared at the half-ruined file tree. Yet before I could speak, my mother appeared behind me and demanded to know why I was yelling at my sister, though I had not raised my voice at all, and when I explained what happened, she waved it off and said Brianna was only curious, and that I should not leave valuable things in places where people might touch them, even though the only person who had touched it lived in that very room and had known exactly what she was doing. My father stood behind her, silent as always, eyes sliding away whenever conflict surfaced, and Brianna leaned back against her pillows, looking entirely unbothered, as if what she had done was a harmless joke, something I should laugh off because in this house, nothing that belonged to me mattered enough to be protected. I walked out before the bitterness rising in my chest could spill out, grabbed an old sweatshirt, and set out on foot toward the nearest Starbucks, a 2-mile walk under a hot July sun, my thoughts swirling between despair and determination. I reached the cafe, ordered the cheapest drink I could justify, and sat in a corner trying to steady my hands as I opened a blank document, forcing my mind to reconstruct everything I had written, reminding myself of the hours of research, the case studies, the personal motivation story that tied my early love of problem solving to my desire to defend national infrastructure. I wrote for 6 straight hours, barely pausing to breathe, letting the frustration pour into the keys until my fingers ached. And when I finally pressed, save I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and renewed resolve, as if every sentence had rebuilt a part of me Brianna had tried to break. I submitted the application that night, unsure if it would stand against the polished submissions of students with supportive families and uninterrupted study spaces, and I tried not to think about the sabotage that had nearly derailed everything. Weeks later, while I was back on campus surrounded by the quiet hum of the library, I opened my email and saw the acceptance letter from the Naval Cyber Defense Command internship program. Not just an acceptance, but an invitation into their civilian fast-track GS pipeline, something almost unheard of for students my age. And as I read the message again and again, the reality settled in layers. Not only had I rebuilt my essay under pressure, but the rewritten version had impressed a selection board known for being nearly impossible to sway. I leaned back in my chair, blinking against the sudden sting in my eyes, knowing that no one at home would ever understand what this truly meant, how close I had come to losing the opportunity altogether, how their attempts to minimize me had ironically pushed me towards something greater. I did not call my family to tell them I did not send a message or share the news with anyone who would twist it into something insignificant. Instead, I let the accomplishment live quietly inside me, like a seed protected from the wind, something only I could nourish. The stolen laptop incident became another marker in the long loop of abuse they would never acknowledge yet, in the strange way that hardship sometimes shapes the future. That night at Starbucks became the hinge moment of my career, the proof that even when everything familiar tried to hold me back, I could still find a way forward. And though I did not know it yet, the system I would one day lead the missions I would command, and the officers who would salute me began with that single night of rewriting my future by the glow of a cafe window. Kyle and I had only been together for 6 months when everything began to unravel, yet in those 6 months, he had become the first person outside the military world who seemed to see me not as a quiet shadow or a placeholder in my own life, but as someone capable, someone worth listening to, And after the endless loops of betrayal from my family, I let myself believe that maybe this small piece of stability could last. Though deep down, I should have known that anything good in my life was something they would eventually try to claim or destroy, and the warning signs appeared almost immediately when I introduced him during a short weekend visit home, because my mother's eyes lit up in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not with curiosity, but with calculation, the sort of look she used when assessing opportunities rather than people, and Brianna's posture shifted from casual indifference to a subtle alertness, as if she had just spotted something she wanted for herself. Kyle, who worked as an engineer at Google San Diego, tried to be polite and open, asking my mother thoughtful questions, complimenting her cooking, laughing at my father's stories, doing everything a good partner would do during a first family introduction. Yet with every passing minute, I could feel the scrutiny, building a silent judgment, coiling beneath the surface, as if they were collectively weighing him against Brianna's desires rather than my own happiness. And that impression hardened later in the kitchen, when I overheard my mother whisper to my aunt that Kyle was more Brianna's type, and that maybe God had finally sent someone decent for the right daughter. I pretended not to hear it, the same way I pretended not to see Brianna brushing her hair behind her ear whenever Kyle spoke, or leaning in closer than necessary when he tried to make conversation. And though Kyle looked uncomfortable, I reassured him it was nothing, telling myself I was imagining the shift, even as dread settled somewhere deep inside my ribs. A few days later, my mother called Kyle privately, something I only discovered because he told me afterward with a voice tight around the edges, and she had told him not to get too attached because I was too cold for marriage and too married to my work to ever prioritize a family, then suggested that someone like Brianna would be a better match for a man of his ambition, since she understood social grace and emotional warmth better than I ever could. And Kyle, shocked and unsure how to handle a boundary he never expected to cross, tried to laugh it off, but I could see that something inside him had shifted. The next morning, Brianna sent him a message, a long one that I never saw, but whose impact I felt immediately, because after reading it, he became distant, quieter, his confidence faltering in ways that made no sense, until he finally admitted that Brianna had warned him that being with me would ruin his career, since in her words, I would always overshadow him and he would resent me for it. And while he told me he did not believe her, the faint uncertainty in his tone betrayed him a tremor I recognized, because I had seen it in others when confronted with the intensity of my work. When I received my promotion to lead analyst at 24, something nearly unheard of in my branch, Kyle congratulated me, but there was a tension beneath his smile, a subtle pulling away, as if success had pushed me just out of reach. And a week later, he ended the relationship quietly on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting across from me at a small cafe near campus, saying that he felt inadequate next to me, that my life was moving too fast, that he needed someone simpler, someone with fewer demands and fewer secrets. Words that echoed every lie my family had planted until they sprouted inside him like seeds he did not realize he had watered. The breakup hit harder than I expected, because it was not just the end of a relationship, but another reminder that no matter how hard I worked, my family's poison could still seep through the cracks of my life. And I walked back to my apartment that night with a weight in my chest heavy enough to slow my steps. Yet I did not cry, something in me locking down the same way it always did when pain threatened to surface, replaced instead by a cold determination that I would not let this derail me the way my family hoped it would. I returned to my routines, burying myself in network defense simulations and encrypted architecture exercises, letting the rhythm of problem-solving steady my breathing. And it was during one of those late nights in the command center that my supervisor approached me with a sealed folder labeled Pacific Breach Preliminary Directive, a label I recognized immediately because only operations with national-level significance carried that designation, and he told me that due to my analytical precision and my ability to stay composed under pressure, I had been selected to join a forward team heading to Hawaii for a classified cyber operation involving hostile attempts to infiltrate maritime navigation systems across the Western Pacific. The words settled over me like a current pulling me forward, because Pacific Breach was the kind of assignment people twice my age fought for, the kind that required trust discretion and a mind capable of cutting through chaos. And as my supervisor explained the scope of the mission, the rotations, the contingency protocols, I felt something inside me straighten a sense of purpose, anchoring me more securely than any relationship ever had. I signed the papers that same night, the ink drying quickly, as if the future itself were impatient. And as I walked out into the cool air, I realized that while my family's interference had cost me something soft and human, it had pushed me deeper into the world where I truly belonged. A world where competence mattered more than charm, where focus mattered more than superficial warmth, and where the people who served beside me valued results rather than appearances. Kyle disappeared from my life as quietly as he had entered it, and I let him go without bitterness, without messages, without attempts to salvage something that had been doomed the moment he let my family's voices drown out mine, because I had no space left for people who crumbled under the weight of opinions that were never meant to define me. Hawaii awaited the operation, and as I boarded the plane, weeks later, with classified documents in my bag and a fire in my chest, I understood that this new path forged from heartbreak and sabotage would lead me toward the identity my family had never imagined I possessed, the identity that would one day bring a Marine colonel to attention in the middle of a room where they expected to humiliate me again. I arrived in Hawaii under a sky so sharp and blue it felt almost dishonest, because nothing about the days ahead would be gentle or bright. And as my boots hit the tarmac at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, I swallowed the knot in my throat and reminded myself why I had been chosen for this operation, why the sealed folder had my name typed on the first page, instead of someone older or someone with a resume filled with decades of service. And it was because when hostile actors began probing the navigation grid across the Western Pacific, slipping through gaps like thin blades of light, the command needed someone who could see patterns inside chaos before those patterns became casualties, someone who could hold conflicting data streams in her head until they bent into clarity, and that someone happened to be the daughter my family had spent years calling a disappointment, a burden, a quiet shadow trailing behind the golden child. The briefing that first night was held in a secured room where the cold air stung my cheeks and the hum of servers made the walls vibrate. And as Admiral Soren described how a foreign intrusion had begun corrupting the maritime positioning systems used by our fleet and by Marine detachments scattered across the region, I felt my muscles tighten with the familiar mix of fear and purpose that always came before a major cyber battle, because this was not an exercise or a simulation. This was a real strike aimed at real units, and the wrong line of code could send ships into unsafe waters or leave thousands exposed on missions that depended on precision. I was placed in charge of the zero-day counterstrike cell, a small team of analysts and cryptographers whose job was to track the intrusion to its source, reverse engineer the exploit, and shut it down before the window closed. And as the hours blurred into each other inside the operations center, we moved from workstation to workstation in a silent rhythm shaped by adrenaline and exhaustion, fingers flashing across keyboards as if speed alone could outrun the threat. 17 hours in, we discovered the first fully deployed payload, a worm buried so deep inside the routing protocol that even our detection software hesitated to acknowledge it. And when we isolated the strand, I understood immediately why the command had nearly panicked, because whoever built this wanted to do more than disrupt systems. They wanted to cripple the Pacific grid long enough to force a tactical retreat across multiple regions, a blow that would have reshaped alliances and exposed our units to catastrophic risk. I drank cold coffee until my stomach twisted and stayed locked in that room for 72 hours with my team, sleeping in 30-minute bursts when my vision blurred. But each time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint echo of Marine troop counts, terrain hazard reports, and the endless reminders of how many would be stranded or ambushed if we failed. So I pushed through the fatigue and kept going, tracing the code through back doors, so cleverly disguised. They almost felt personal. A challenge whispered in binary, daring me to fail. On the third night, I found the final thread, a narrow vulnerability that would let us inject a counterworm to collapse the hostile structure from within. And the moment I executed the command, I felt the room shift, a collective breath, held by everyone present as we watched the network diagnostics refresh and confirm one line after another that the navigation grid had stabilized, that the attack had been neutralized, that the Marine battalion whose coordinates had been exposed would not be walking into an ambush after all. And when the final confirmation rolled across the screen with the count of how many men and women had just been pulled back from the edge, 2,173 Marines, the room fell silent in a way that felt sacred. My commanding officer looked at me with an expression I had only ever seen in moments where life and death had hung within seconds, a mixture of awe and the quiet recognition of what it meant to carry responsibility without breaking. And it was that moment that earned me the unofficial name, whispered inside secure corridors, Ghost Vega, because I had appeared where the grid had begun to collapse, decoded an exploit no one else could parse, and disappeared back into the operational shadows once it was done. For a brief moment, I let myself feel proud, the kind of pride I never tasted at home, a pride rooted in service sacrifice and measurable impact. But the feeling dissolved the moment I landed back in Temecula for Thanksgiving, stepping into my parents' living room still smelling faintly like ocean air and cold server rooms, because when my mother opened the door, she did not smile or ask about my flight, or even glance at the fatigue in my eyes. She simply said, "Oh, good, you made it," and then called out to my father that I must have finally fixed whatever computer problem had kept me too busy to attend the last family dinner. I stood there with the memory of 2,000 Marines standing between life and death, still burning behind my ribs, while she waved me off like a distracted clerk filing a forgettable document. And when I tried to mention Hawaii, she interrupted immediately, saying she hoped I had at least tried harder to be social this time instead of hiding behind a laptop, then complained that I looked pale and tense, as if I had chosen to ruin the holiday mood. During dinner, she leaned across the table to tell Mrs. Halpern, our neighbor, that Brianna might be appearing on a local lifestyle segment for her social media work, a moment she delivered with breathless excitement, pointing out how proud she was of Brianna's achievements. And when Mrs. Halpern asked politely what I had been doing lately, my mother laughed lightly and said something vague about me still doing that office computer stuff for the government. Nothing interesting, nothing anyone would want to hear about at a festive gathering. I felt the humiliation settle under my skin like frostbite, not because I needed her validation, but because the contrast between the lives saved and the life I had been reduced to in her narrative was so stark it made the walls tilt. And the worst part was that she truly believed the story she told, the version where I was simply a distracted tech girl whose job inconvenienced family holidays. And as Brianna launched into a detailed explanation of her upcoming television appearance, while my parents beamed, I felt the realization cement itself that nothing I accomplished in that world would ever matter in this house. I excused myself early, stepping outside into the crisp air, reminding myself that they would never understand what Ghost Vega meant or why my exhaustion was lined with purpose. And as I walked to my car, I knew that their dismissal would be the fuel for the reckoning that was quietly gathering on the horizon. Thanksgiving of 2023 began with the same uneasy heaviness that always came with returning to my parents' house. Yet this time, something inside me felt different. A faint but steady hum just beneath my ribs, the afterglow of Operation Pacific Breach, still echoing through my muscles, even though no one in that home would ever ask what I had done. No one would ever understand the weight of 72 sleepless hours or the quiet pride of saving 2,000 Marines whose families would be gathering around their own tables that very evening. And as I drove through Temecula, with the dry California hills rolling past my window, I felt an unexpected calm settling over me, as if some invisible shift had already begun long before I reached the driveway. The house was buzzing with noise when I walked in, the clatter of dishes and the exaggerated laughter that always came out when my mother wanted guests to think everything was perfect. And I stepped through the doorway just in time to see Brianna glide into the dining room with a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit trailing beside her, the kind of man who radiated confidence built on connections and expensive education. And before she even saw me, she announced loudly that this was Christopher, a corporate attorney from Los Angeles, who had been featured on a podcast she adored, and who apparently made more in a quarter than most people made in a year. My mother practically swooned as she rushed toward them, greeting him with a smile so wide it seemed to stretch across her face, and as she ushered him toward the head of the table, she spotted me lingering near the doorway, her expression tightening just slightly, as if my presence threatened the carefully curated image she was trying to build. She approached me with a stiff smile that never reached her eyes, then reached for my chair at the long dining table, dragging it back several inches with a soft scrape that cut through the room like a blade, and in a voice sweet enough to make my teeth ache, she said that Christopher should sit near the center because guests of significance always deserved prominence, then added, as she lightly tapped the backrest, that I would be more comfortable at the smaller side table near the kitchen where the kids usually sat. For a second, I thought I had misheard her, but when I looked around the room, the truth settled like a cold stone in my throat. Christopher being guided into my seat, my parents beaming proudly as if Brianna had just brought home royalty, and the side table sitting off to the corner with mismatched chairs and a stack of napkins that someone had tossed carelessly onto the surface. Brianna did not even pretend to hide her satisfaction, tossing her hair back as she leaned into Christopher and whispered something that made him chuckle politely, and the humiliation that washed over me was so sharp it burned my skin, a reminder that no matter what I accomplished, I would always be the daughter pushed to the fringes whenever a more impressive story entered the room. I stood there silently for a long moment, fingers curled at my sides, feeling the sting of every Thanksgiving and Christmas and birthday, where the message had been the same, that my existence was always an afterthought, always conditional, always secondary to Brianna, and whatever man she brought into our orbit. My mother gestured impatiently to the side table again, as if I were a stubborn child refusing instructions, then said that she did not want any tension tonight and that it would be nice for once if I did not make things uncomfortable by taking up space where I did not belong, and something inside me finally shifted in a way that felt irreversible. Instead of sitting down, I stepped back slowly, my chair legs brushing against the tile, and I said nothing. Not a word of protest, not a plea, not an explanation, because the silence itself felt heavier than anything I could speak. Then I turned toward the front door as the clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation resumed behind me, none of them noticing that I had not even taken off my coat, none of them caring enough to ask where I was going or why I had not stayed. The cold night air hit my face as soon as I stepped outside, the kind of chill that clears the mind with a single breath, and I walked to my car with a steadiness that surprised me because for the first time in years I was not leaving out of hurt or avoidance, I was leaving out of clarity. Inside the car, I let my hands rest on the steering wheel for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the quiet fill the space where shame used to live. And as the streetlights cast soft gold across the windshield, I whispered the words that changed everything for me, a promise instead of a reaction, a declaration instead of a retreat. No more silence. It was not rage that fueled me. It was resolve, a kind of still strength shaped by years of endurance and sharpened by the knowledge of who I had become when I was not under their roof. I had barely driven 2 blocks when my secure phone vibrated in my bag, the distinct encrypted tone that only came from high-level communications, and I pulled over at a dark stretch of curb to check the message, my breath catching as I scanned the header. The Cyber Strategic Advisory Board was assembling a new task group ahead of the fiscal year, a group composed of senior defense leaders and top-tier analysts, a group typically filled by those in their 40s or 50s with 20 years of experience. And somehow, my name had been added to the short list by a member of the Joint Chiefs who was impressed by my role in Pacific Breach. The message requested a preliminary interview, then outlined the promotion track that would be available if accepted GS-15 Step 4, a level that analysts my age rarely even approached, a level that signaled national influence, policy shaping, authority, and strategic leadership across the entire Pacific theater. I stared at the message, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly across the dark interior of the car, and a slow, powerful understanding spread through me, one that filled every space left hollow by the dinner table humiliation, because while my own family had pushed me to the corner of a room to make space for a man they met 30 minutes earlier, the Department of Defense was trying to pull me into a circle of leaders whose decisions altered global balance. I realized then that my life had already diverged from the version my family kept trying to shove me into, and as I put the car back in drive, I did not feel sadness or anger anymore, only certainty, because they had no idea that the quiet daughter they dismissed had just stepped into a level of influence none of them could comprehend, and the calm that washed over me felt like the first breath of a new future. I drove away from the house knowing one truth with absolute clarity. I would never again shrink myself to fit into a seat they chose for me, because the next time they tried to place me anywhere, it would be in the shadow of a rank they never imagined I could hold. The days leading up to my grandparents' 60th anniversary celebration moved with an uncanny stillness, the kind that settles just before a storm, and although I had already made the silent vow in my car on Thanksgiving that I would never again shrink myself just to keep the peace, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother, the preview lighting up the screen with a length that already told me everything I needed to know. And when I opened it, the words unfolded in a long, unbroken stream. Each sentence, another reminder of the hierarchy. She believed I belonged to a hierarchy built on image compliance, and her unshakable belief that Brianna was the only child worth presenting to the world. She began by saying the anniversary party would be a once-in-a-lifetime event, a gathering of respectable families from across San Diego, people with reputations that mattered, people who should not have to witness anything disruptive. And before I could even roll my eyes, she launched into her familiar litany of instructions, telling me not to wear anything dark because it made me look severe and unfriendly, telling me not to bring up my complicated government job because those conversations drained the room, telling me not to sit at the main table because the seating needed to reflect seniority and decorum, telling me not to talk too much with the more established guests because I tended to come across as awkward or overly technical, and each line pulsed with that quiet condescension that had been trained into her voice over the years, a tone that somehow managed to both dismiss and command at the same time. She ended the message with what she probably considered kindness, saying that it would mean a lot to the family if I could just avoid making anything uncomfortable, if I could simply be pleasant and invisible. For one night, a request she genuinely believed was reasonable, even generous, because in her mind, the best version of me was the version that blended into the background where no one had to be reminded that I existed. I read the message twice without reacting, my face expressionless, and then typed the only response she would accept without spiraling into melodrama. I will be there, sending it with the same steadiness I used when confirming classified briefings, because she did not need to know that her instructions had already become irrelevant the moment I stepped into the GS-15 candidacy lane, the moment Senior Command began quietly circulating my name across the Cyber Strategic Advisory Board. I placed the phone face down on my desk and reached for the small lockbox I kept inside my closet, sliding it open to reveal two items almost no one in the civilian circle of my life knew existed: the badge that authorized unrestricted clearance across multiple Pacific installations, and a letter embossed with the seal of the Marine Corps. A letter written by the Commandant himself, thanking me for the actions I took during Pacific Breach and for the lives preserved by decisions I made under pressure. A letter that did not exist publicly, but carried enough internal weight to shift military negotiations. I traced a finger lightly across the embossed text and felt the hum of quiet authority settle through me again, a stark contrast to the way my family had always tried to frame me as fragile or socially inept or some awkward footnote to Brianna's glamorous life. They had spent years shaping a narrative in which I was the child who never quite fit, the one who needed managing, explaining, correcting, while Brianna floated effortlessly above consequence. Yet here in my hands lay proof that the world they thought mattered was nothing compared to the world in which my name actually held weight. I knew that bringing the badge or the letter to the party would violate protocol if flaunted, so I did not intend to show them openly, but their presence reminded me that the truth had a way of emerging without theatrics, especially because the guest list contained a name that made my pulse change rhythm the second I recognized it. Among the expected attendees listed on the family group chat was Colonel David Rourke, a man I had never met face to face, but whose voice had once crackled through an encrypted line during Pacific Breach. A man who had commanded one of the Marine units we saved in those 72 frantic hours, a man who had signed the after-action report praising the cyber cell responsible for reversing the breach before it could compromise his battalion. He would not know my family name, but he would know the code name Ghost Vega, the moniker the internal communications team had used when referencing the analyst who cut through the hostile code in record time, and it made my hands go still for a moment as I imagined the collision of two worlds that had remained carefully separated for years. The family that treated me like a perpetual embarrassment would finally be in the same room as someone who had witnessed the impact of my actual work, someone who had felt the gravity of decisions I made with consequences that stretched far beyond Thanksgiving dinners and petty jealousies, and the thought carried a quiet satisfaction that warmed me in a way my mother's approval never could. That night, as I prepared the simple navy dress, I planned to wear the one my mother always scolded me for because it looked too plain and too serious. I caught my reflection in the mirror, seeing the faint exhaustion still lingering from the operation, but also something stronger, something steadier, something that belonged to a woman who no longer feared their judgment because she had stepped into a circle far larger than the one they tried to confine her to. The instructions my mother had sent kept drifting through my mind, each one now feeling more absurd than the last, because she still believed she could choreograph my behavior the way she arranged the seating charts or the floral centerpieces or the smiling narratives she fed her friends, and for the first time I felt not anger, but a kind of knowing detachment, recognizing that she clung to these rules because she had no idea who I truly was, no idea what I had already become. When I finally placed the badge and the letter back into the lockbox, securing it with a quiet click, I whispered the promise that had carried me out of the house on Thanksgiving, a steady vow that grew stronger each time I repeated it. No more silence. This time the storm would not pass quietly, and if my mother wanted a perfect celebration with spotless reputations and polished smiles, she had unknowingly invited the one person whose mere presence would unravel every illusion she relied on. And for once, I felt ready to let the truth speak for itself when the moment arrived. The night of the anniversary celebration arrived wrapped in a kind of polished extravagance. My mother adored a performance disguised as a family event, and as I drove toward the La Jolla Country Club, the glow of the coastline shimmered in the distance, like a thin silver line guiding me forward. though I felt none of the excitement the rest of my family surely carried, only a steady readiness settling into my bones as I prepared myself for the predictable ritual of being diminished in front of people who would never know the truth of what I had done. The parking lot was already overflowing with luxury cars when I arrived. Rows of glossy black sedans and spotless SUVs, reflecting the warm light spilling from the ballroom windows, and the sound of elegant chatter drifted through the air as I stepped out, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy dress, the same dress my mother always called severe, though tonight I wore it like armor, a reminder that I did not need glitter or embellishment to carry weight in rooms far more consequential than this one. Inside the ballroom gleamed with white linen tables, floating candles and towering floral arrangements, each selected to impress the crowd of San Diego elites my parents had spent months curating. And the moment I entered the space, I saw my mother across the room, gesturing animatedly to a cluster of friends. Her smile stretched tight and bright, the kind of smile she used when she sensed she was being watched, and I recognized instantly that she was narrating her version of our family, again showcasing Brianna's perfect life while strategically omitting me from the frame. As I approached the edge of the crowd, the DJ's microphone crackled slightly before my father stepped onto the small stage to begin introductions, a tradition they created to highlight the achievements of each family member, though it had always been used as a tool to elevate Brianna and diminish me, and even though I had prepared myself for this, my heartbeat still flickered beneath my ribs as I waited for the inevitable. My father began with the easier highlights, praising distant cousins for their new homes or career promotions, and then gestured proudly toward Brianna, who stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone who had always been applauded regardless of merit. Her voice sugary as she introduced herself as a marketing director and rising social media personality, adding that she had recently crossed 40,000 followers, which drew gasps from women who clearly believed numbers equaled prestige. Next, he introduced Brianna's husband, the ever-polished banking vice president, who shook hands with a stiff self-importance that hung in the air like cologne, and my mother beamed as if she herself had secured his title, her hand clasping his arm in a gesture meant to telegraph elegant stability and her perceived success as a parent. When my turn approached, I could almost feel the shift in the room, the collective expectation that I would once again be presented as the outlier, the one whose life needed explanation and right on cue. My mother leaned toward the microphone with a breathy laugh that sounded both rehearsed and dismissive, lifting her champagne glass slightly as she prepared the audience for yet another version of a story that had never belonged to me. She said my name with a kind of theatrical fondness that felt sharpened at the edges, then let out a soft chuckle as she announced that I worked in office IT, pausing just long enough for the room to absorb the implication that my job was trivial, replaceable, unimpressive, and she added that I helped with computer issues for some government branch. Nothing glamorous, nothing worth going into detail about, nothing that anyone needed to trouble themselves trying to understand. And the crowd responded with polite, lukewarm applause, the kind given to someone whose existence is acknowledged but not valued. I felt the familiar sting rise in my chest, but I kept my expression still, my hands at my sides, my breath controlled because anger would only feed the story they had built, the story that painted me as fragile or overly sensitive, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of reaction. A man standing near the stage raised his hand with casual curiosity and asked loudly whether I fixed computers for Geek Squad or some similar company, his tone more amused than insulting, but the question rippled through the guests in a way that made my stomach turn the kind of light ridicule that grew when people assumed they were safe from being corrected. And behind me, someone whispered that it was a shame I had not found a clearer path in life, given Brianna's success, as if our worth existed on a shared scale, as if her shine required my dimness to be complete. My mother thrilled by the attention, shrugged and laughed again, saying that technology simply suited me, that I preferred hiding behind screens instead of interacting with real people, that I was always a bit strange in social settings, and she said these words casually, almost affectionately, as if she were sharing an inside joke, rather than publicly branding me with labels she had spent years planting. I listened to every word without moving, letting the humiliation settle over me like a familiar coat. Not because I accepted it, but because I understood that this was the final chapter of their performance, the last chance they would ever have to define me in front of an audience before the truth arrived uninvited. As the introductions shifted back to the stage and my mother returned to her table with a triumphant smile, another voice cut through the chatter behind me, quieter and more cautious, belonging to a man I did not recognize. Someone standing alone near the edge of the crowd with a glass of wine in hand, his brow furrowed slightly as he stared at me with an intensity that made me pause. He asked softly if my last name was Cade, his voice carrying none of the mocking tone the others had used, and when I nodded, he hesitated, searching my face as though matching it to some distant memory. Then said he had read an article last year about a classified cyber incident in the Pacific that had been partially leaked to the press, an article that mentioned a strategist named Cade involved in preventing a major breach, and though much of the information had been redacted, the name had stayed with him because the incident itself had generated so much speculation among defense insiders. I felt the air shift slightly as he spoke, a subtle tightening of the space around us, and while I kept my expression neutral, I sensed the first fracture in the narrative my family had crafted so carefully, the first whisper of something they never anticipated, because someone in this room finally recognized a truth they had spent years burying under jokes and dismissals. And this recognition came not from the people who shared my blood, but from a stranger who had glimpsed the outline of the world I actually moved in, the world they could never understand. And as his question hung in the air, I felt something steady and powerful rise within me, a quiet certainty that the illusion my family depended on was beginning to crumble, and that the moment of reckoning woven through the threads of this night was drawing closer, inevitable, unstoppable, and far louder than anything they had tried to craft through microphones or choreographed introductions. The man who had recognized my last name drifted back into the crowd before I could respond, leaving a thin thread of suspicion suspended in the air, and I felt the room pulse with a shifting energy, as if the walls themselves sensed that the performance my family had constructed was seconds away from tearing open. And while conversations resumed and glasses clinked across the ballroom, I could feel a faint trembling beneath the surface of the evening, a subtle warning that the moment I had unknowingly been walking toward for years was finally arriving. The first sign came in the form of a sudden hush near the entrance, a ripple moving through the guests as the doors opened and a tall figure stepped into the foyer, the kind of presence that commanded attention without raising a voice, dressed in full evening uniform with ribbons catching the warm light. And even before I could fully see his face, I felt the shift in the air around me, the way sailors feel wind changing direction before a storm. Colonel David Rourke walked into the ballroom with the steady, uncompromising gait of a man who had spent decades carrying responsibility, heavy enough to shape his spine. And as he scanned the room in a casual sweep of evaluation, his gaze landed on me for the briefest second before freezing entirely, his foot halting mid-step, his shoulders locking his breath, visibly catching in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone unfamiliar with military discipline. But I saw it instantly, the exact moment when recognition cut through the surface of his composure. His expression shifted as if someone had shattered the world he expected and replaced it with one he did not know how to navigate, and in the span of a heartbeat, the color drained from his face as he corrected his posture. With sharp precision, his hand rising instinctively to adjust the fall of his uniform before he straightened fully, the sound of his heels clicking together, echoing across the polished floor like a warning shot. Conversations around us stumbled and broke as guests turned to see why a decorated Marine colonel had suddenly gone still. His eyes locked on a woman they believed to be an awkward office IT worker with nothing interesting to contribute, and before the weight of their curiosity could fully settle, Colonel Rourke moved, stepping toward me with deliberate purpose, each stride resonating with the unmistakable discipline of someone approaching a superior officer. My mother, sensing attention shifting away from Brianna and her carefully curated narrative, leaned into the microphone again with a confused laugh, raising her hand as if to redirect the spotlight back onto the parts of the evening she could control. But before she could speak, the colonel stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, squared his shoulders, drew in a sharp breath, and the room collapsed into absolute silence. His voice, when it came, cut through the air so clearly that the chandeliers seemed to vibrate every syllable, distinct and heavy with meaning, as he said, "Cyber lead, Amelia Cade Ghost. Vega Mom." His salute rising with such precision, it carved the moment into the memory of every person present, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to slow, as every conversation, every laugh, every whisper in the ballroom fell away, leaving nothing behind but the image of a Marine colonel standing at rigid attention. Before the daughter my family had dismissed as a disappointment, a gasp rippled through the room like a wave, glasses lowering mid-air forks frozen halfway to mouths as guests tried to process the impossibility of what they were witnessing. And somewhere near the stage, my father stood with his jaw slack, looking between the colonel and me, as if trying to decipher a language he had never bothered to learn. My mother gripped the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, her face draining of color so quickly she looked almost translucent under the soft amber lights, and Brianna, who had been adjusting her hair while preparing to launch into yet another monologue about her social media reach, stumbled back a step as if struck, her hand flying to her chest, while her eyes darted frantically between me and the colonel with a confusion so raw it almost bordered on fear. The colonel did not move, did not blink, did not waver as he held the salute, and when he finally lowered his hand, he turned toward the stunned guests and spoke with a quiet intensity that carried across every inch of the ballroom, saying that the woman they had just watched be introduced as an office IT worker had saved the lives of more than 2,000 of his Marines, that without her leadership during Pacific Breach, he would not be standing here tonight, that her actions had prevented an attack that would have reshaped the Pacific theater and devastated Marine units across the region. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the weight of memory pressing against him. And for the first time that evening, the room no longer felt like a stage designed for my mother's carefully polished illusions. It felt like an interrogation chamber where every lie they had spoken about me was being dragged into the light by someone who owed nothing to my family and everything to the truth. A woman near the front covered her mouth with both hands, whispering something about the article she remembered reading, and whispers began to swirl around the room as the name Cade took on new meaning, connecting the quiet girl they had mocked to the classified story that had briefly circulated before vanishing behind redacted lines. My mother made a small, choking sound, a mixture of disbelief and desperation, as she tried to speak into the microphone, attempting to salvage a narrative that was crumbling faster than she could grasp it. But her voice faltered into an incoherent stutter, the light in her eyes fracturing as she realized that the daughter she had spent years belittling had just been elevated in a room she no longer controlled. Brianna swayed as if her heels had suddenly become unstable, her confident posture collapsing into confusion, her eyes wide with the dawning horror that the sibling she had mocked and undermined might be more powerful, more respected, more extraordinary than she had ever imagined or allowed herself to believe, and the silence that followed the colonel's words settled over the ballroom with a density that felt almost physical. Then, as if some invisible switch had been flipped, Phones began to rise, guests whispering to each other with frantic excitement, and I caught sight of small red lights blinking as people began recording, capturing the moment a Marine colonel had revealed the truth about the person my family had tried so desperately to keep small, and the room erupted into a storm of stunned murmurs and hurried questions as the realization spread that the entire scene was being live-streamed by multiple guests whose audiences were already flooding the feeds with disbelief. I stood there without moving, letting the noise swell and crash around me, feeling none of the humiliation I had carried for years, only a calm clarity as I met Colonel Rourke's eyes in a silent exchange of understanding, because he had not saluted the persona my family believed existed. He had saluted the woman I had become far beyond their reach, and as the ballroom dissolved into chaos around us, I knew with absolute certainty that the world they had constructed for me had finally shattered beyond repair. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic hum the moment Colonel Rourke finished speaking. The silence that had held every guest in a frozen trance, dissolving into a tidal rush of whispers and gasps as people scrambled to understand how the woman they had watched being mocked on stage moments earlier was suddenly the center of gravity in the room, and before I could even register the shift, a crowd began forming around me, guests pressing forward with outstretched hands and eager voices asking for photos, trying to thank me, trying to claim proximity to a story that had blown apart the careful image my mother had curated for years, and the intensity of their sudden adoration would have felt surreal if not for the calm that settled into me, a stillness carved from years of being dismissed and underestimated in this very family. Cameras flashed as strangers leaned in to capture their selfies with me, forcing me to take small steps back to avoid being smothered, and I could feel the collision between who they thought I was and who I actually had always been, their voices tripping over each other as they praised actions they could barely comprehend, and somewhere behind the crush of people, Brianna pushed her way forward, her smile stretched so tight it looked painful as she attempted to slide into the frame of a photo being taken with me. But before she could wedge herself beside me, Colonel Rourke stepped subtly but firmly between us, his voice dropping into a low, controlled command as he said that respect was earned long before a camera appeared, and that anyone who wished to stand beside me needed to understand the meaning of gratitude and humility first, and the flush that climbed up Brianna's neck as she stumbled back was a shade of red I had never seen on her, a color shaped not by embarrassment alone, but by the dawning realization that the hierarchy she had relied on her entire life was collapsing right in front of her. My mother appeared seconds later with her arms wide, her face twisted into a smile so performative it made the muscles around her mouth tremble, and she moved toward me with the same eager desperation she used whenever she wanted attention from important people reaching for my shoulders, as if a staged embrace could repair the story that had just shattered. But I stepped back with a steadiness that cut through her momentum, lifting a hand between us as I said clearly and quietly enough for those closest to hear that she did not need to act, that she should not pretend affection she had never shown, and the words struck her harder than a shout would have, freezing her mid-step, as cameras caught the moment her reach fell short, the moment her narrative broke beyond recovery. The live stream continued to surge as more guests pointed their phones toward us, sharing the unfolding collapse with neighbors and colleagues and community groups, and within minutes whispers turned to notifications, screens lighting up with comments from people who recognized Colonel Rourke from veterans who suddenly understood who Ghost Vega was, from locals stunned by the contrast between the family's humiliation and the truth of the daughter they had ignored, and the weight of that collective gaze settled over my mother and Brianna like a storm cloud they could not outrun. Conversations began shifting sharply as guests huddled together, murmuring about the cruelty they had just witnessed at the microphone, recalling every condescending laugh my mother had delivered throughout the night, questioning out loud how a family could treat someone with such contempt, only to find out she had spent her 20s protecting people they would never meet. And even as the ballroom remained crowded, I saw the subtle physical recoil happening around my parents. People stepping slightly away from them as though proximity itself carried risk. Brianna's phone buzzed relentlessly as notifications from her influencer accounts exploded with comments, many from viewers who had stumbled onto the live stream and were now calling out her behavior, labeling her as someone who mocked a family member who had served the country, accusing her of cruelty, entitlement, and hypocrisy. And I watched her expression shift from irritation to confusion to a tightening panic as she opened her inbox, reading the first wave of messages from brands. She worked with each one, expressing concern about the negative attention surrounding her name. The tone, professional but cold, reminding her that their partnerships depended on public alignment with values she had just violated in front of hundreds of witnesses. It did not take long for the consequences to escalate because people in our community were not just watching, they were reposting, commenting, condemning. And even the sponsorship she had been bragging about earlier in the evening sent a curt message stating that their upcoming collaboration would be paused until further review, a pause that anyone in marketing knew was simply a polite prelude to termination. The night darkened further for her when her husband, who had been lingering near the bar with a stiff drink in hand, received a notification that made the blood drain from his face. His eyes scanning an email from his company's human resources department, requesting a mandatory meeting to discuss the live stream. Circulating with his family's name, attached a live stream that now included clips of his wife laughing while I was insulted. Clips of him standing silently beside her as she dismissed me, clips of the colonel correcting her with a tone colder than steel. And as he read the details again, his drink sloshed slightly in his hand, revealing the tremor he tried to hide. Someone beside him whispered that companies in banking took reputational matters seriously, especially when the drama included military figures and viral attention. And his shoulders sagged as the truth settled over him that his wife's behavior might cost him far more than a quiet apology could repair, because no corporation wanted negative press tied to insensitivity towards service members or their families. Meanwhile, my mother attempted to regain footing by clinging to guests who no longer wanted to be associated with her, her voice climbing in pitch as she insisted that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had not known, that she only meant to joke, but no one responded with warmth. And the few who nodded did so out of politeness, rather than belief, their eyes already shifting away, already disconnecting from a woman whose performance had unraveled in front of the very community she sought to impress. My father retreated to a corner table, staring at the floor as if trying to understand how decades of insistence on perfection had led to this moment, and I realized with a distant ache that he was a man who had spent his life prioritizing calm over truth, a man who had let silence become complicity, and now silence could not save him. Through all of it, I remained steady, answering questions from guests politely but succinctly, keeping my demeanor, even as the ballroom swirled with speculation and shifting alliances, and every so often Colonel Rourke would intercept someone who pushed too close, creating a small barrier of respect around me that no member of my own family had ever offered. When the DJ finally attempted to regain control of the evening by restarting the music, the room felt forever changed, because the illusion my family had crafted for years had not simply cracked, it had collapsed in front of an audience large enough to ensure it would never be rebuilt, a collapse carried by live streams now being clipped and reshared across the very social spaces Brianna had once believed she ruled. And as I stood at the edge of the room watching the fallout unfold, I felt none of the guilt or hesitation my family would later try to force on me, only a quiet acknowledgement that truth once spoken does not retreat. 1 week after the party, I woke to my phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand, the kind of persistent buzzing that told me the caller was not someone willing to give up easily. And when I saw my mother's name on the screen, I hesitated for a long moment before answering, because I already knew what tone she would use, the soft, breathy voice she reserved for moments of desperation. And the second I picked up, she launched into a strained mixture of apology and justification, saying that she had been overwhelmed that night, and that maybe she had gone a little too far on the microphone, and that she certainly had not meant to embarrass me in front of all those important people. Her words tumbling over each other as if speed alone could rewrite what the entire community had watched live. And then her voice shifted into a pleading urgency as she asked me to help repair the family reputation before things got worse. She said Brianna had lost several sponsorships and that people in the neighborhood were gossiping, and that the church committee had called to ask whether the rumors were true. And she insisted that this was all a misunderstanding that I could fix with a single message, maybe a public statement saying I was not offended, maybe a post explaining that the salute had been exaggerated by social media. And she added that it would be a tremendous help if I could use some of my military connections to get Brianna considered for a job in a government-related program, because she needed something stable now that her marketing income was unstable, and she kept talking, as if the only obstacle was my pride, rather than the decade of contempt she had cultivated toward me. Her voice trembled when she said, "Amelia, please do this for the family," and I let the silence stretch because she needed to feel it, the weight of a boundary she had never imagined I would enforce. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out calm and unshakably, even as I told her that respect was not a favor she could request, that it was not something I owed her, and that she would have to live with the consequences of how she had treated me. And she sputtered a little in confusion because she was not used to me speaking without apology, and she tried again to say that all she wanted was for things to go back to normal. But that was the one outcome I could no longer allow. When I ended the call, I sat for a moment staring at the screen, the quiet in my apartment wrapping around me like something solid, and a clarity settled into me that felt like the final click of a long locked door finally opening, because it was time for the quiet justice I had promised myself I would no longer avoid. I opened my laptop and accessed the public copy of the live stream, the same clip that had already reached thousands of viewers, and I sent it directly to the HOA board of the gated community where my parents lived, attaching a brief note stating that they had misrepresented my service and attempted to use my credentials for personal social leverage, the kind of behavior that violated their community guidelines for leadership positions. And the response was swift and almost startlingly firm, an email the next morning confirming that my mother and Brianna were temporarily barred from holding any association positions or representing the community in any capacity, a consequence that might seem small to some, but to them was a direct hit to the social hierarchy they clung to. The news spread quickly among their neighbors, and several residents reached out to them demanding explanations. And for the first time in my memory, my mother found herself on the defensive, rather than the offensive, forced to acknowledge that the community she had tried so hard to impress had watched her belittle her own daughter in front of a Marine colonel and dozens of witnesses, and no amount of selective storytelling could soften that fact. But the deeper twist came when an internal security compliance officer from my agency reached out to me about the viral video, because the Department of Defense has strict regulations regarding personnel whose family members create public incidents that draw attention to their roles, and the officer explained that due to the circulation of the clip, I would be required to limit unnecessary contact with individuals who could pose inadvertent information, risks a policy meant to protect classified material and ensure clear separation between personal pressure and professional duty. And even though the officer spoke politely, the subtext was unmistakable, because the individuals in question were my own family. I listened quietly as he clarified that the regulation did not bar me from speaking with them entirely, but strongly advised reducing involvement in situations that could be manipulated for public or social gain. And when the call ended, I sat back and let the surreal weight of it settle over me, the realization that my mother had spent years insisting that I was the shame of the family, only to become a formal liability to my career because of her own behavior, a truth so sharp it almost felt poetic. I followed the guidelines exactly as instructed, not out of spite, but because I had earned every clearance and responsibility through work they had never bothered to understand. And when my mother called again 2 days later with another rushed attempt to bargain her way back into control, I answered with the same calm tone and told her about the regulation, explaining that for my own security protocols, I needed to minimize contact for the foreseeable future. And the stunned silence that followed was the first time in my life I had heard her truly speechless. She tried to argue that she was my mother and that these rules could not possibly apply to her, but I simply repeated what the officer had said, reminding her that this was not my choice. It was federal policy. And when the call ended, my hands were steady in a way they had not been for years, because for once, the consequences of her actions did not fall on me to absorb. Word spread through the family that I had pulled away, and they treated it like abandonment, ignoring the reality that they had pushed me away long before I ever stepped into uniform. And in the days that followed, I felt the strange quiet of justice settling into place, not dramatic or vindictive, but firm and irreversible. The kind of justice that comes from choosing truth over performance and peace over proximity to people who only valued me when they needed something. It was the first time in my life that distance did not feel like loss. It felt like freedom. When the dust finally settled and the last mandatory compliance update was filed, I packed the few belongings that mattered and moved to a small apartment on Coronado Island, a quiet second-floor unit with a balcony overlooking the narrow strip of water between the naval base and the shoreline. And every morning when I heard the distant cadence of training drills carried by the wind, I felt a strange calm settle inside my chest, a peace that came not from escape, but from finally choosing a place where my life was not measured against anyone's expectations, a place where I could breathe without waiting for the next remark or the next dismissal. Coronado was filled with service members who minded their own business in the most respectful way possible, people who greeted me politely in the hallway without prying, people who understood the invisible weight that comes with clearance and duty. And as the weeks passed, I found myself easing into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. A rhythm built on quiet mornings, long runs along the Silver Strand, and evenings spent reviewing classified material for the new Cyber Strategic Advisory Board. I had been invited to join a board composed mostly of seasoned experts decades older than me. And when I walked into the secure meeting room for the first time and saw the surprise on their faces, I understood that this was the first room in my life where I would not have to fight for a seat. The work was demanding in a way that felt invigorating, involving threat pattern projections across the Pacific network grid and advising commands on counter-intrusion posture. And even though I was the youngest GS 15 Step 4 ever appointed to that advisory team, no one questioned my presence. Instead, they listened, they took notes, they asked follow-up questions. And for the first time, I felt the full contrast between a family that had spent years trying to reduce me and a professional world that valued clarity, discipline, and results over appearances and hierarchy. One afternoon in early spring, the Public Affairs Office requested a portrait session for an article featuring women in national defense, a small recognition piece for recruitment and outreach, and I agreed without thinking much of it. But when the magazine arrived a month later and I saw my own face on the cover, framed by the headline charting the rise of the youngest strategic cyber lead of the decade, I felt a quiet shock run through me. Not pride, not vindication, something gentler, something like finally being seen accurately after years of being framed through someone else's bitterness. The magazine circulated quickly among military families in Southern California, and it did not take long for the link to reach my parents' circle, because the next morning my inbox held an unread message from my father, a short email with no greeting and no flourish, Only a single paragraph, written with a sincerity I had never heard from him in spoken words, where he said he was sorry for not protecting me, sorry for not speaking up, sorry for every moment he let silence do the work of cruelty, and he ended by saying he was proud of me, but did not expect a response, and hoped I was well. I read it twice then, 3 times, feeling an ache rise in my chest, an ache not rooted in longing, but in the quiet recognition that sometimes apologies arrive too late to repair anything, yet they still carry meaning, because they acknowledge the truth that everyone else tried to deny. And even though I did not write back immediately, I saved the message not as reconciliation, but as closure. My mother, on the other hand, did not write, "Not that week, not the next," and I realized that shame can be a gag more powerful than any order, because she had watched an entire room discover a daughter she never bothered to understand, and I no longer felt the familiar mix of anger and grief when I thought of her only a distant acceptance, the understanding that some people will cling to their version of reality even when the world collapses around it. Life on the island continued quietly, and every so often I would see a group of Marines running past my building at dawn, and I felt a private connection to them. Not because they knew me, but because I knew what it meant to stand in a room full of people who underestimate you and refuse to bow your head. I knew what it meant to hold a line no one could see, and to choose integrity over comfort, and those mornings reminded me that identity is not defined by blood, but by the values you choose, and the people who honor them. A few months later, during a briefing at the base, a senior officer stopped me to say that he had watched the viral clip from the family party and that he wanted me to know something simple and direct, that respect earned in silence is often stronger than praise earned through spectacle. And I carried that sentence with me long after the meeting ended, because it felt like the perfect summary of everything my life had become since walking out of that Thanksgiving dinner. My family still lived in the same house in Temecula, still surrounded by neighbors who now understood the truth, still attending the same church, where whispers followed them down hallways, and although they never said it aloud, I knew they felt the shift in power that comes when the person you dismissed rises far beyond the reach of your judgment, and for the first time, none of that stirred any desire for revenge in me, because the punishment had already arrived through the most natural force in the world, consequence. Some evenings I would sit on my balcony as the sun set and the last helicopters returned to base, and I would think about the girl I used to be, the one who stood quietly while her family spoke over her, the one who believed that endurance was the same thing as love, the one who swallowed every insult because she thought silence preserved peace. And I felt both sorrow and pride because that girl had carried me through the years it took to become a woman who knew her worth without needing witness or validation. I no longer hated my family. Hatred required energy and attachment, and I had chosen neither. Instead, I chose the steadier path of living, well working with purpose and surrounding myself with people whose respect came from understanding rather than hierarchy. And when I thought about everything that had happened, from the stolen laptop to the empty chair at Thanksgiving, to the microphone humiliation that started it all, I understood something clearly: that triumph is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the quiet certainty that you survived without becoming what they tried to make you. In the end, the story of my life was never about convincing my family to see me. It was about learning to stop shrinking in order to remain within their line of sight. I do not need their approval. I do not need their apologies. I do not need the version of me they created to make themselves feel bigger. I only need the truth, the one that stood beside me in every room where they tried to erase me, the one that rose with me through the ranks they said I would never reach, the one that held steady. The night a Marine colonel saluted me in front of them, and as I sit here now, with the ocean wind on my face, I know with absolute clarity that I do not need my family to recognize who I am. I only need the truth to stand with me. If you have ever been dismissed by your own family, share the words you wish you had spoken. Someone out there needs to hear your voice.